Welcome to A Cloudy with a Chance of Insights. I'm Richard, and as always, I'm joined by Cyrus. Unfortunately, David is not with us this week due to project commitments. This is one of the joys of doing this part-time, I suppose. But anyway, we've got quite a bit to get through today. I'm going to start with something called harness engineering, which I think is one of the most important concepts in the AI development space right now. And I'm not sure that most enterprise teams have actually heard about this. From there, I'm going to talk about Agent 365 going GA at the start of this month because we missed that sort of last time. And then what that means for organizations that Microsoft are going to be pitching it to over the next few months. Cyrus is going to take us through something very practical this week around Defender antivirus settings and Intune, specifically how organizations often assume Defender is configured correctly, when in reality, settings can drift, conflict, or be changed locally, and how attackers can exploit that. And then, time permitting, I want to zoom out and talk about Microsoft's 2026 Work Trend Index. So, let's crack on. Harness engineering. This is a term that's been building in the AI engineering space since late last year, give or take. And the reason I want to talk about it is that I think it names something a lot of organizations are experiencing but can't quite articulate, which is the model works. The demo's good, the proof of concept is also good, but then it falls over or fails in production. The stat that keeps coming to me is that 88% of AI agent projects never reach production. And the consistent finding is that bottlenecks is not the model. The model is increasingly a commodity. So the bottleneck is everything around the model. There's a formula apparently attributed to a chap called Mitchell Hashimoto, I hope I'm going to get that right, where the agent equals model plus harness. So the harness becomes the control system that wraps around the model to make it reliable, observable, and governable in production. So 3 components: guides, sensors, and the data context pipeline. Now, what's interesting, at least to me, is that in the Microsoft and GitHub ecosystems, each of these components already has a name and a place it lives. Guides are the documents and constraints that tell an agent what it needs to know and how it should behave. If you've written a file in GitHub repo or defined a custom instructions in Copilot, or even set up a system prompt in Copilot Studio or Semantic Kernel, you've built a guide. You probably, and I certainly don't, call it that. Now, sensors are the feedback loops: evals, login, tracing, anomaly detection. In the Microsoft stack, that's GitHub Actions, eval workflows, Azure Monitor, App Insights. So the telemetry hooks into Semantic Kernel and MAF, or Microsoft Agentic Framework. The question every architect should be asking is, when this agent runs in production, can I see what it did, why it did it, and whether the output was any good? And the data context pipeline in the mechanism, excuse me, that gets the right information to the agent at the right time. From the agent's perspective, anything not surfaced in context does not exist. So knowledge sitting in documentation, in Slack threads, in Teams, in colleagues' heads is all invisible unless the harness surfaces it. In the Microsoft world, that's your Azure AI search grounding, Fabric data pipelines, graph connectors, etc., etc. So there was an OpenAI case study from earlier this year. So 3 engineers, some production code base of fairly sizable, roughly 1 million lines, 0 human written code. So the engineers didn't write code, they designed the harness. So the guides, constraints, files, sensors, feedback loops. Their output was the harness. The agents wrote the code, and that is a genuine shift in what software engineering means. So for us architects, and I do still loosely consider myself an architect, the question becomes, do you actually have a harness strategy? Because what I'm seeing is that organizations that have a model choice and a framework choice and are then calling that an AI strategy. So evals, observability, guardrails, context governance, all absent, in most cases anyway. When it fails in production, there's no way to diagnose it. And we've been here before with every technology wave. The ones not thinking about this now will be retrofitting under pressure in the next 6 to 12 months. For consultants, the harness is where the differentiation is. So eval design, observability, architecture, etc., etc., etc. That's the engagement that's actually valuable, not the model selection and the choice around models. For developers, especially I suppose those doing vibe coding like myself, is harness-free baseline. So it works for demos, but that 88% failure rate is substantially the vibe coding failure rate. And I'll be honest, I can probably vouch for this as well. If I look at the stuff that I've been doing, would I necessarily put that into a full production environment? I'm not sure I would do. It's great for demos, great for proof of concepts, really good for sort of spinning out POCs or POVs or whatever you might want to call that. But would I vibe code a fully enterprise production app?
No. Yeah.
Not at the moment, I don't think. Anyway, so that's harnesses in a sort of abstract description. So Microsoft have just shipped what they call their commercial answer to the governance piece of this, which is Agent 365. Now, as I said at the beginning, and I think everybody listening to this podcast or even watching this podcast probably is aware, Agent 365 was released on the 1st of May this year. So about 2 weeks ago, give or take, from the time of this recording. So that also included Microsoft 365 E7, which they're calling the Frontier Suite. And we've talked about Frontier platforms and enterprises, etc., numerous times over the pod. So, but what's interesting here, I think, is that this is the first licensing tier that they've added since 2015, give or take. So commercially, this is important because this is going to change how much organizations are paying for their licenses, which again is an interesting sort of diversion here because that licensing, and we've talked about this before, it's not necessarily that the licensing structure is changing. They are adding things to that. So Copilot was an addition to that licensing pack, which it still is to a certain extent, but not an actual new tier. So anyway, so we've got a new tier, which is E7, which includes Agent 365. And yes, before anybody puts in the comments, you can get that for $15 extra independently. You don't need to go the E7 stack. Anyway, Agent 365 becomes the control plane for the agents, centralized visibility into every agent in the organization, whether built on Microsoft platforms, partner platforms, or registered independently. That is a very key point, by the way. It has to be registered. So if you're using a system outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, just for argument's sake, say it's based on Claude, if you're not using the SDK or specifically having some integration into the Microsoft Agent 365 stack, it won't be covered in that. But anyway, Entra for identity, which we know about, which Cyrus has talked about that a number of times, and so have I. Defender for threat protection, Purview for data governance, Intune for endpoint management. In harness terms, it's Microsoft's attempt to productize the sensor and governance layers. Some generally interesting capabilities are in there. So from June, I think Cyrus might be covering some of this later on as well, Defender provides asset context mapping per agent, which is really, really interesting, especially for some of the things that I was doing around the Microsoft Graph, for example. The Sentinel Graph. I do need to make sure I differentiate between the two, which was around basically asset contextualization. So anyway, they're also introducing MCP servers into that mix, associated identities, reachable cloud resources, and probably a load more, which basically is the blast radius visibility that security teams actually need. Then finally, there's a bit of registry syncing in there with AWS Bedrock and Google Cloud, which is in preview, which means in theory, discovering and I'm really struggling to talk today. But anyway, discovering and inventorying agents across non-Microsoft platforms. So in effect, smart multi-cloud governance play. I'm not going to cover the licensing off. We've already sort of broached that a bit, and I think there's enough data out there on the net for anybody that's interested in the licensing. And it is probably worth a conversation at some point, but I don't think that's necessarily right here. So bottom line, I think anyway, and I'm not sure, Cyrus, what your views are on this, is that A365 or Agent 365 is probably a necessary starting point. But it's not a complete harness. It gives you the visibility, or at least starts to give you the visibility and the governance guardrails, but it doesn't really give you the eval frameworks of context engineering and several defender and purview capabilities, as we know are still in preview, or as I found out a little while ago, and I think we talked about in 2 or 3 pods time previously, was that they're not even in the Microsoft Graph yet, so let alone anywhere else. One thing to point out about that, which is semi-related, vaguely, so flex routing or routing, if we're talking to our American friends. So if you're an EU or EFTA tenant and you haven't checked your Copilot settings since April, Microsoft is now routing LLM inferencing outside the EU data boundary during peak demand.
Yeah.
So for new tenants, it's a gotcha here. It's on by default, although I'm not sure how many people are going to be spinning up new tenants these days. But anyway, it's on by default for a new tenant. So that is a GDPR and DORA conversation that you probably need to actually start to thinking about. It is worth mentioning it is only during peak demand, so I don't know what the stats are around that, but I'd assume that most of it is still staying within the boundaries. Anyway, so we've talked about harness engineering, the agent governance layer, and I think it's probably about time I stop talking and hand it across to Cyrus to cover off his topics.
About Agent 365, this is typical Microsoft strategy. The product is not complete, but they always talk for big enterprise. So all the governance, compliance. So this is very Microsoft classic strategy, and it works because with clients they think okay, we need compliance. We are a bit afraid, and they don't think of IBM or any other one. They just go Microsoft. It's easy as a tick box. We know that we will not have problem by going this direction. So it's a very, more I think about E7, more I think it's very intelligent. And you said 11 years they didn't invent a new licensing model. My struggle is what you said at the beginning. You said 87% of AI project doesn't reach production, and that's a huge number, because if you look for all the hype in the past, like cloud and all this big industry change, there were attempts that failed, obviously, because it was not mature, and like people follow the trend and they try to be the first and they try to save costs, etc. And even with the containerization in the late 2010s, we didn't saw those big numbers. Now there's like 87, so there's a huge hype, but it's so raw that, and you mentioned also rightfully the vibe coding stuff, which you're right, and we can digress, and I try to avoid, but there's so many people in my personal network that quit the comfortable job to go do their own adventure, and we know behind the scene is a lot of, I can vibe code, I can do more, I'm more, I feel more confident to do this adventure. And you just need 1 or 2 MVPs to see that actually what I had in my head works. But then what's dangerous is that a lot of people I see also can do that internally for production stuff. And that's like the Dunning-Kruger effect. When you think that you master everything, your prompt give you say and it becomes, it's almost like your little god. You say and it becomes, but it's how it's built is very like full of like, more than me, like full of security breaches, CVs.
I'm glad you brought that up, Cyrus, because I was going to talk about this with an internal colleague yesterday. As I said, it's an open secret on here, and actually within most of my peers within IBM, is that I'm doing an awful lot of vibe coding at the moment. Again, I am saying that's not going into any production environments. It is primarily for either proof of concepts or demos or other things like that, where I can spin it up relatively quickly, show it, and then hand it across to people who can actually do the work properly. But I've added in, I started to actually more productionize one of the projects that I'm working on, just more for a learning experience than anything else. So I added it to Sonar Cloud. to do some security vulnerability as part of the CI/CD pipeline. And what I found was really quite interesting. Now, I need to obviously expand that across other projects to see whether this pattern is consistent. And it was one of the later projects that I'd worked on, which meant that I think that some of the constructs were more robust anyway because of the lessons I'd learned from the previous projects and brought into this one. But it was still quite a complex system, multiple databases, multiple data sources, Node, TypeScript, web platforms, integration into AI systems, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I digress. So I stuck it into, but I integrated Sonar Cloud onto that. And I was using the free version as well because this was a, side project. And I didn't want to use either an official IBM license or pay for it myself. But it came back with, and you'll probably raise some eyebrows now, about 400 security vulnerabilities or alerts, whatever you want to call them, or risks, whatever. But when I looked at them, it was very, very weird. And again, this is why I need to expand this out to other projects. It picked up about 15, if memory serves me correctly, sort of high severity issues to pick up on.
It's violent.
Everything else was low. So it seems that when it gets something wrong, it gets something very, very wrong. And when and everything else is just minor rubbish, which I thought was very, very odd. And again, some of the critical ones were ones that I might well have introduced myself if I was writing the code. But some of them were very simple things around structures and what variables are being passed and session information, that sort of stuff. But I thought it was very interesting. There didn't seem to be a middle ground. It was either a really big hole or just little silly ones that you didn't really need to probably even think about fixing.
That's actually very interesting.
But
so no, that's very interesting because that's actually more reassuring. Because yes, the obvious ones, like for me, it's like the how do you identify the users, and like it's MVP, it's designed for MVP. So obviously you don't have, like, for example, the passwordless or these kind of things, or you're not configure, for example, Entra or whatever identity piece you have. Like, it's designed to test. But I thought it will be more medium stuff, like unknown TVs.
It was very weird. There's just a big gap. So a small number, in percentage terms, a small number of critical ones. Obviously, anything over 1 is a big number of critical issues. But compared to the bulk of the items that I discovered, it was a very small percentage. And almost, there might have been a couple, but it just went from critical to low.
Wow. Maybe you need the paid version of Sonar Cloud. I don't know.
Well, and again, I will clarify that was the free version. I'm sure if the paid one might have given me some more insights into what was going on.
But that's very interesting to check, actually, because that's the gap we need between, like, can you do prod? That's the dream, right? Like, you go from MVP to prod. Okay, sorry.
And again, I knew this was happen that because David's not here to keep us on track. But the other interesting thing I found about Sonar Cloud, and I don't know again whether this was just me being a bit naive in how I set it up, but the first run doesn't actually throw any errors and passes the sort of builds. It's only on the second one where it goes, oh, hang on a second, you've got loads of stuff going on here, and I'm going to fail the build, which I thought was a bit of an odd thing. So I don't know. That, as I said, that's probably me. So anybody feel free to tell me in the comments that I did something really stupid there. But yeah.
To be fair, I always thought I badly configured Sonar Cube, Sonar Cloud. So when I do this test, it's the same, but I thought it was probably me. So next time you do that, let's call each other and just see, because I'm really interested, honestly, by this.
So that was diversion number 1.
Yeah. Sorry, it's my fault.
And so we'll keep a diversion count, and I don't know, perhaps I'll put a ticker on the bottom of the screen for those watching on YouTube.
Yes, we need like a prompt that alerts us.
Yeah.
I was thinking of Meryl Fernando. He just left yesterday Microsoft, and he posted a message and said, okay, I will continue to work on Meister. I will continue to work on anything, and I want to do my own project. So again, you see, there was this. I'm sure there's vibe coding behind the scene, but okay, I stop the digression here. anyone can check.
It's probably worth an intro, and the work trend index that if I've got time, we'll sort of cover off at the back here. I think is going to, when you sort of drill down into that into a lot more depth than I currently have, I think some of these patterns might well come up, because it is so tempting for someone with an entrepreneurial spirit to actually go, as you said, right, I can do this. I mean, good grief, I'm looking at deploying an app onto the Apple Store. If I can, stomach paying them 75 quid for the privilege of putting an app on the App Store. And I wouldn't have done that 2 or 3 years ago, because I would have had to have actually invested an awful lot of time to go and do that. And again, the app is very, very simple. There's no real security issues around the app that's going out there, and it's for my wife's help to support my wife's business. But anyway, that's a completely separate topic. So that's diversion number 2 in the space of 5 minutes.
That's the goal of the podcast, but maybe the best moment is the digression. Okay, sorry, I go to my more tangent on Defender and Intune. So I was scrolling again, as usual, LinkedIn, and I'm going to give you a name again. Probably you know him, Rudy Holmes. I really like the guy, and he worked at Patch My PC. If you want to learn Defender, if you want to work on Intune and learn about device management, and someone was probably like a really digressive brain, because he go in details, and I really like to go in details and learn how things work behind the scene. That something is not in the documentation, I follow him. And this time I was really baffled by this kind of things he found, and it's called controlled configuration for Microsoft Defender antivirus settings. So that's a mouthful. And the reason I like this topic is that it touches a very real problem that we have in endpoint security. So most organizations spend a lot of time asking this simple question: do we have Defender deployed? And even if you do like compliances, or if you look for security assessment, you have a list, and one of the key requirements is always, is it deployed? Checkbox, done, and end of story. The question is useful, but it's not enough. And the better question is Defender still configured the way it was intended right now on the device that is under attack? And the difference matters, because in real incidents, attackers often try to reduce visibility before doing the noisy part of the attack. They may try to disable antivirus, and that's the main one. If you do capture the flag, the first thing you try, if you know there's Defender, you try to completely make the Defender useless, and we'll see how. Weaken cloud protection, you can add exclusion, stop services, abuse vulnerable driver, I'll give you an example, or use any local administrative rights to change security settings. We saw this kind of pattern with ransomware groups as well. Like, for example, Akira. They describe attackers abusing a legitimate Intel-related driver as part of the bring your own vulnerable driver technique. It's famous. The goal is to weaken Microsoft Defender protections before continuing the attack. And that's almost like, it's not something new. It's something like studied. Like if you learn anything, Entra or whatever, like this is something you learn literally. It's red teaming, purple teaming. So the problem is very simple. A security product can be strong on paper, and we know Microsoft is very strong on marketing stuff, on papers, and still become weak on a specific machine if its configuration can be changed, bypassed, or quietly drift away. This is why control configuration becomes interesting. And honestly, I invite you to check the documentation that will be under the videos. The idea is to make Defender antivirus settings more reliable when managed through Intune. So Intune become not just some place you push policies. And I know none of my colleagues like Intune. And I am passionate about Intune, but I know people, I have to use Intune. But that Intune become a central source of control, that the policy is the same. And that's more interesting. So as I said, the point is not just to send a policy once. The point is to make the policy harder to weaken afterward. For example, think about exclusion. That's one of the key. Exclusion are sometimes needed for performance or compatibility. We know Defender, when they had to coexist with different EDR, a different solution, we do follow the documentation, and a lot of that time is like, oh yes, step one, do add some exclusion, and you give the task to an engineer, or like with no more. But exclusion is very dangerous actually. A bad exclusion, it can become a blind spot, right? If local admins, old scripts, legacy group policies, or another management path can add exclusions without proper governance, your antivirus policy slowly turns into a list of places where a defender is invited to look away. And even on your personal device, like if you do exclusion, this is the place where the attack will happen necessarily. So control configuration is important because it reduces the gap between the central security baseline and the real state of the endpoint. And for me, this is the big lesson. Defender configuration is part of incident readiness. We talk about readiness all the time. During an incident, you do not want to discover that protection was half enabled, cloud protection, as I said, off, sample submission was disabled, or exclusion were wider than expected. Because then, if you're an MSP, you become responsible. Like when there's a silly incident, like we check what happens on like postmortems, and this is one of the things that triggers silly conversation. So what should organization do? First, use Intune to manage Defender antivirus settings centrally. Avoid having Defender settings split across too many places, and that's like basic hygiene. Like you have all GPOs, scripts, local admin change. The worst is co-management, doesn't work, or manual exception. Second, enable tamper protection. We don't say it enough. This is like old school method already. Tamper protection, Microsoft described tamper protection as a way that helps stop change to important Defender settings. It's one of the key controls that helps stop malware or local change from weakening the Defender. Third, treat Defender exclusion like a firewall rules. And that's something that I've learned recently. Like the same team that manages the firewalls should also be responsible of treating the exclusion. You should have a painful process internally to manage those exceptions. You should have like an owner, a reason, an expiry, or a review date for every risk decision. And then an exclusion without governance is just a quiet security hole, to be honest. And fourth, monitor the state. Defender and Intune can help, but teams need to actively look for devices where Defender protection is disabled, cloud delivery protection is off, etc. And we are tempted here to talk about dashboards, but you know my opinion about about dashboard. So you don't need more dashboards, but you need to have the same process you have in place, alerting on the fifth one is connected to this one. Connect this to Microsoft Sentinel, any kind of like a SIEM or SOAR, or even Defender XDR hunting. You can put in place a lot of native alerting on if someone had an exclusion, if someone disabled the protection, if there's a load of suspicious driver, right? You can create literally an alert or treat that as an incident. You don't need to do like a admin footnotes, etc. It can be treated. We know we are bombarded with like notification or not bombarded with alert fatigue, but this is serious. This is how it works in real life. The bigger point we have also like identity compromise and endpoint weakening often work together. We talked a lot about identity. I will not digress here. We know an attacker may enter through identity, but once they land on a device, they want persistence, right? They want privilege, they want movement, and especially silence. This is what we're discussing here. I'll probably stop here because there's a lot more to say, but what I can do to conclude is, I will stop here because then it's just like I will digress. But yeah, so the key point is you have a policy that is enabled that we know, but make sure that they cannot be changed. That's the whole thing about this news. And I invite you to read the article. That is for now not an official one, but it's still good to read.
Excellent, thank you, Cyrus. Yes. Blocking the ability to change or update policies is probably a very good idea for Microsoft to do.
It's weird that it was not the case. Like it's still today in a playbooks of a lot of like apprentice hacker, and Defender was not respected for a long time. And that was a problem for people going to E5 licenses, because they said, oh, Defender, I know my son can deactivate it, and do that. There was a lot of videos on YouTube that were doing Defender bashing. It changed now, and it's also all documentations, and it's not perfect. And that Defender is extremely popular, and a lot of different antivirus can be the same. So it's something we often overlook, and this is the entry point. It's as stupid as like you do all these policies, all this protection, but if your Defender is off, or it's just you add exclusion, then all the things you built is become useless. We measure a security system by its weakest link. That's one of the weakest link. That's why I was alarmed and interested about that news.
As I say, it's always cybersecurity is a very interesting area in the fact that defenders have to be right all the time, whereas an attacker can be just lucky once and then get away with not get away with it, but achieve what they wanted to. And configuration issues, regardless of whether that's policies and things like that, seem to be the biggest cause, certainly of the bigger sort of notifications that you see. And I'm going to point my finger at AWS, but Microsoft had the same issue with blob stores. But unsecured S3 buckets on Amazon, for example, a common cause of data leaks, if nothing else. So just locking those down with the default policies, and even not changing those default policies unless there's a real reason to do so, it's always a good practice. But it just shows how easy some of these things can be. Oversharing controls in M365, for example, it's so easy for a user to do it. And I get that you might want to not put blockers in front of users using the systems and collaborating and doing things that they might want to do as part of their day-to-day job. But there has to be a balancing act between security and usability. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox for that one. I'm going to switch the topics around that I was going to cover off next. Now, Cyrus knows this because I've been chatting with him on Slack about this. And listeners or regular listeners will know anyway that I've been vibe coding now with GitHub Copilot, Claude Code for about a month, 6 weeks now, something like that. I thought I would take the plunge, especially since I do work for IBM, and install Bob. So if people aren't aware of Bob, you're probably not on LinkedIn because mind you, it's also the network effect. There is I get inundated with Bob posts on a hourly basis on LinkedIn. But anyway, if you're not aware, Bob is IBM's, I'm not going to say it's an answer or competitor to GitHub Copilot. I think there is a slightly different use case there, but that's something I'm going to be exploring probably in a blog post in a couple of weeks around actually how they might work together in a sort of complementary way. But first impressions for this was, especially, and again, I'm going to stress this, especially coming from a vibe coding sort of experience, was that it was a lot more user-friendly than I think GitHub Copilot is, and arguably than Claude Code is as well. I know that there are some things in Claude Code like artifacts, which are very, very easy to sort of spin up and do, but I'm not really comparing apples to apples in using that example. So it obfuscates a lot of the complexity away by default, which I found interesting. So, for example, and I know you can do this in GitHub Copilot, and you can do this within Claude. At least, I'm not sure about in Claude Code, but in Claude you can do this, which is basically just have the auto picker set for the models. But in fact, in Bob, it doesn't even show you what the models are. You don't get a choice. So that's an example of where it's trying to obfuscate the details away. And again, I gave it a fairly complex spec to build, and it built, spent, probably half an hour building it away. It had two compilation errors anyway, out of the space of that, which is actually, in my experience, quite a good hit rate. for a multi-page, again, using a data source, web front end, AI integration, standard stuff for what I build these days, apparently. And yeah, two compilation errors, and I would typically get that with GitHub Copilot probably every time I write a line of code. Sometimes it's a little bit inconsistent, especially on auto mode, because it tends to pick things like haiku quite frequently, which frustrates the hell out of me. But bottom line, I was quietly impressed with what it did. Yes, there is the whole thing for external users, not in IBM, about Bob coins, which I'm not even sure about the name, quite frankly. But that's the sort of method that IBM are using for your subscription thresholds, etc. So Bob coins. But yeah, worth having a look if you're into vibe coding or AI assisted development. I would definitely at least have a look and see how it goes. Interface is very similar because basically it's just in VS Code. It's just an extension in VS Code, which does block you having Copilot and Bob in the same window, but you can use the CLI potentially for Bob if you wanted to, or just have it in a different setup. So, but as I said, bottom line is I would give it a go. And I know, Cyrus, you've been using it a lot more than I have. So feel free to chip in on that one.
No, I became, for the audience, I became like a viewer. And I was waiting for your feedback because you have more experience than me on the vibe coding. You have produced so much things, actually, that were presented, demos and stuff. So you tried all of them. And I did a bit of GitHub. I didn't like it at the time. I know it changed and the autopilot was not really there, or not working as the way I wanted. But yeah, no, Bob is exactly as you described. I have few errors compared to what I had with a Copilot when I had to keep troubleshooting. But yes, the coins, yes, it's a bit weird because we internal from IBM, I expected a bit more coins. I was actually interested to know how you spent so much in few hours, but probably when you initialized this big project that existed.
Yeah.
So that's probably why. I'm more interested to monitor how your spending is used with your kind of vibe coding style.
So for the listeners and viewers, the way that I'm doing this now is a little bit aligned with the spec-driven development sort of process. Not fully, because obviously I'm me and I do things my own slightly weird way. But basically what I'm doing these days is writing a big spec. Big, I don't know whether big is the right word, but it's a spec and it's fairly detailed. It will say exactly what it is that I'm looking to do. It will include things like test cases, definition of done, blah, 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 blah. So these MD files now get to be fairly sizable. So the good thing is that I can now pass that to a coding agent. Doesn't really matter which coding agent it is. And in theory, it's got enough information there that after a few questions with me, perhaps in plan mode, if I'm a little bit sort of sketchy on what it is I want to do, it's got enough information to go ahead and run with that. Now, what I found, and I did feed this back to Cyrus and actually to the product team as well, and again, I think this is probably my configuration more than anything else, is that if I did that in GitHub Copilot and Claude Code to a certain extent, I can basically just let it go. You can set the autopilot, I think it's called, on GitHub Copilot, and it will just run away in the background. So I could leave it, come back in half an hour, and in theory, everything would be done. Bob was doing that, but it was prompting me for a lot more sort of approvals. Even though I'd set auto approve on, it was coming in every so often say, are you sure you want to do this? Or I need additional permissions to do X or whatever it is. So that interrupted the flow a little bit and probably made the process a little bit longer, because the way that I do also like to do this, again, this is probably not interesting for anybody, but the way that I personally like to do this is I'll send a big prompt and I'll go and work on something else. And then I'm expecting it to ping and then I'll go, right, it's finished the prompt. Let me go and have a look, spin up the dev server. Let's see what it produced. Here I was having to sort of come back to it every so often just to say yes. And because you don't go immediately to do that, you might be on a call, you might be in a conference, whatever it might well be, it sort of slowed it down. So anyway, I fed that back, but that was probably just because it was the first usage and I hadn't configured all the bits and bobs. And again, I hadn't done the Claude MD or the Copilot instructions equivalent within Bob, et cetera, et cetera. But again, having said that, quietly impressed with the output.
Yeah, think of Bob is very young, so it's like a needy child. He needs your attention, Richard. That's why he wants more to interact with you.
Yeah, but just to Cyrus's point, which I didn't actually address, in that 2 hours or 3 hours so of work, it used up 40% of the monthly allocation of Bob coins for that particular workload. So I'm going to have to really think about how that is being done. And that didn't include calling MCP servers. Well, actually, it did. It probably called the Carbon Design MCP server. So again, for those that aren't aware, IBM has a design framework called Carbon, which I actually quite like.
Me too.
It's very enterprisey, so it's not going to give you some sort of flashy like bells and whistles and gizmos and widgets and stuff. So it's a very professional, sort of clean design framework. Go and have a look at it if you're interested. It is used quite widely, apparently, within the industry, which I wasn't aware of.
Me too.
But I do quite like it. And there is an MCP service. You can just point your agent at it and go, yeah, use the Carbon Design System. And it does give you, I mean, obviously, design systems are a very personal choice, but it does give you very consistent results, which is what you want from a sort of the UI design element.
I'm surprised they give that for free because that's making IBM style application. And we know IBM design is used by the best in the industry. Like Apple reused IBM literally design the way they create like letters, like the logos on the public side. So you have that for free. So enjoy it.
Well, we're working with, again, I probably have to be very careful what I say here, but we're working with Microsoft on a project at the moment, and their UX team are using our IBM Carbon Design framework.
They have to. It's Microsoft is good for plenty of things, but for design, they're not good. Sorry, we know that.
So anyway, that's a big plug out for IBM on what is ostensibly a Microsoft-focused podcast. But there you go. Credit where credit is due. The Carbon framework I really like, and Bob, despite some of the sort of teething issues that I had with it, did give me very competent and usable results. So, plus, go and have a look at both if you're interested in that area. Now, I was going to cover off the work trend index that Microsoft released earlier on this week. I'm probably actually going to skip that and leave that for the next episode, just due to the fact that we're coming up to about 45 minutes, give or take, which is, a good sort of cut-off point for this pod. So I will just pass across to Cyrus to add any last thoughts that he had. And again, apologies for people that were expecting to see David and listen to his architectural wisdom this week, but he will be back in 2 weeks' time, I'm sure. Cyrus.
Yeah, we needed David also for the Microsoft research. That's my favorite part. But yeah, for the next week. No, just IBM Bob. The version 2 is coming soon. I'm not sure if I can share the date. I'm not sure if it's a public or private information. So soon. No, I think that's good. There's nothing to add.
And it does have quite a nice logo, and whatever the icon that shows up in the Windows taskbar is quite cool as well. But anyway, there you go. Enough of that.
Okay.
So, thank you as usual for everybody for tuning in, listening, or watching us on whatever platform that you choose. Please do drop us a like, drop us a comment, especially on these things like the Sonar Cloud stuff. To tell me that I was doing something completely wrong there. Or if you have views on harnesses in AI, whatever it might well be. So please do like, comment, subscribe, etc., etc. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much again, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.